He used to believe that love meant sacrifice. That every hour spent at work was a promise, a silent way of saying I'm doing this for you. He woke before dawn, long before the world began to stir, and left his house in quiet darkness. The streetlights still hummed, the air still cold with sleep. Through the window, he could sometimes see his children curled up on the couch, waiting for a goodbye that never came. He told himself it was temporary, that one day, when things finally slowed down, he'd have time to sit with them, talk to them, maybe even laugh again. Each raise, each bonus, each new title felt like proof that he was getting closer to that day. But slowly, something else began to change. His daughter stopped leaving drawings on his desk. His wife stopped waiting for him to call. And the house that once overflowed with small voices began to echo with the sound of his own footsteps. He thought he was protecting them from struggle. He didn't realize he was teaching them to live without him. Every morning followed the same quiet rhythm. The alarm at 5:30. The sound of the shower. The hum of the coffee machine in an otherwise sleeping house. He'd button his shirt carefully, each movement deliberate, not out of vanity, but out of habit. Years of routine had replaced reflection. There was no time to wonder if this was how he wanted to live. There was only time to keep going. The drive to the office was a blur of streetlights and silence. The city was still waking up, joggers crossing streets, buses half empty, shopkeepers rolling open shutters. He found a strange peace in being early, in knowing that while others still slept, he was already earning. At work, he was dependable. The kind of man everyone could count on but no one really knew. His calendar was full, his desk spotless, his inbox always cleared before lunch. People said he was disciplined, driven, the kind of man who gets things done. He liked hearing that. It reminded him why he started this, to be worthy of the life he wanted to give his family. Back home, life unfolded without him, quietly but steadily. His wife became the one who fixed the leaky faucet, who went to school meetings, who learned to fill the silence of dinner with conversation that didn't need him. His children grew in height and distance, from bedtime stories to closed doors, from "Dad, watch this," to "maybe later." He missed the transitions, the invisible, irreversible ones. The first time his daughter stopped checking the window when she heard a car pull in. The first time his son stopped asking when he'd come home. But he didn't see those moments slip away. He was too busy convincing himself he was building something bigger, something they'd all thank him for someday. And every night, when he returned, the house was dark but neat. The kind of order that hides absence. He'd walk past the family photos on the hallway wall, his own frozen smile beside faces that were quietly changing. He'd sit at the kitchen table, open his laptop, and tell himself one more hour wouldn't hurt. After all, this was for them. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. It happened on a Tuesday, an ordinary day that looked no different from the hundreds before it. The kind of day that begins with routine and ends with a quiet, unremarkable fatigue. He was sitting in his car outside the office, hands resting on the steering wheel, engine still running. The dashboard clock read 7:42 p.m. The building behind him glowed in sterile white light, rows of empty cubicles and screens still awake. He should have gone inside hours ago, but something in him paused. He stared at his reflection in the glass, the tie slightly loosened, the eyes tired but still alert. For the first time in a long time, he didn't see progress. He saw time, leaving. He reached for his phone and noticed a message he'd missed hours earlier. A photo from his wife, their son standing on a small stage, microphone in hand, wearing a wrinkled white shirt. The caption read, "He finally did it. First school play." He zoomed in, grainy pixels forming a moment he wasn't part of. The expression on his son's face was nervous, proud, looking out into an audience where his father wasn't. He sat there, staring at that photo until the screen dimmed. For years, he had measured love in effort. But effort, he realized, is invisible to those waiting for presents. That night, he drove home slower than usual. The streets were nearly empty, lights changing with no cars to stop. He passed by the park where he used to take his kids on weekends. The swings hung still. The benches were empty. When he reached home, the house was quiet, not the comforting quiet of rest, but the heavy quiet of distance. He walked through each room, noticing small details that had changed without him: a new lamp, a different painting, the absence of toys. His wife was asleep on the couch, a book open beside her. The TV screen glowed faintly, showing some late-night talk show no one was watching. He stood there for a long time, watching her breathe. She looked peaceful, but not in the way he remembered. It wasn't the peace of contentment. It was the peace of someone who had finally learned to live around absence. He sat down beside her, careful not to wake her, and looked around the room he'd built but hadn't lived in. Every object was evidence of care: furniture, photos, everything he'd provided. But not one of them made him feel known. For the first time in decades, he couldn't escape the thought: he had given them everything, except himself. The next morning, he didn't set an alarm. He woke to the sound of sunlight and silence, and for a moment, he didn't know what to do with either. He tried to make up for lost time. But time, once lost, doesn't wait for apologies. In the weeks that followed, he started coming home early. At first, it felt strange, like walking into someone else's routine. The house moved on rhythms he didn't recognize: dinner at 7, laughter from another room, quiet music playing in the kitchen. He'd stand in the doorway, briefcase still in hand, watching scenes that no longer needed him. His wife greeted him kindly, but without surprise. Her eyes didn't light up like they used to, not out of resentment, but because she had long learned not to expect him. His daughter, now a teenager, nodded politely before disappearing back to her phone. And his son, the same boy from the photo, barely looked up from his homework. It wasn't anger that filled the room. It was indifference, the slow erosion of intimacy. A kind of quiet that only grows after too many unkept promises. He sat at the dinner table, listening to them talk: school, neighbors, plans for the weekend. He laughed where he could, added words where he thought they fit. But it felt like joining a conversation that had started years before he arrived. That night, as he lay in bed beside his wife, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't hold it either. She was already asleep, or pretending to be. He stared at the ceiling, realizing that the life he'd built for them had become one they lived without him. At work, things continued as usual. Promotions, meetings, small victories, the currency of validation. But it all began to taste different. The compliments from colleagues felt hollow. The congratulatory handshakes sounded like echoes. He was succeeding in every way that didn't matter. One evening, his manager called him into the office with a smile. Another offer. Another title. Another chance to prove himself. He looked at the paper, the numbers, the prestige, the kind of opportunity he once would have celebrated. But this time, he didn't feel pride. He felt distance, from who he used to be, from what he thought success meant. That night, he walked home instead of driving. The city lights blurred through the drizzle, and every reflection on the wet pavement looked like a version of his life, beautiful, but unreachable. He thought about how many moments he'd traded for the illusion of security. How many dinners, how many stories, how many small, irreplaceable pieces of life he had bartered away for comfort. When he reached home, he found his wife at the kitchen table, reading. He told her about the offer. She smiled softly and said, "That's good." No excitement. No conversation. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a man she no longer knew how to celebrate. He nodded, then sat across from her. The space between them was small but felt like years. And in that space, he understood something. Success doesn't keep people close. Presence does. He excused himself, walked into the living room, and stopped in front of the old family photo on the wall. The three faces smiling back at him, frozen in time, untouched by regret. He realized then, he had worked his whole life to give them everything he never had. And in doing so, he had taken away everything they truly needed. He started waking earlier again, not to rush to work, but to sit in the silence he used to ignore. The same coffee machine hummed, the same dawn light crept through the window, but it all felt different now. For the first time, he could hear the house breathe. He noticed the framed drawings his children had made years ago, faded colors, uneven lines, names written in awkward handwriting. Each one felt like a letter from a time that still loved him without conditions. He hadn't realized how many of those memories had been waiting for him, untouched, patient. He began to change small things. He drove his son to school instead of leaving before sunrise. The first morning, they said almost nothing. But by the end of the week, his son began to talk, small things at first. Teachers. Friends. A joke he'd heard. It was awkward but real. And it reminded him of something simple. That connection isn't built in grand gestures. It's built in repetition, in being there. At work, he stopped staying late. He could see the quiet disapproval in his manager's eyes, the subtle surprise in his colleagues. To them, he was slipping, losing ambition, losing edge. But to him, it felt like something else entirely, release. He started walking home again, no phone, no headphones, just the sound of his own thoughts. He thought about how easily a man can mistake motion for meaning. How chasing security can become its own form of poverty, the kind that empties a person while filling a bank account. At home, the changes were slow, almost invisible. His wife smiled more now, but gently, as if testing whether the peace would last. His daughter still kept her distance, but she began to linger in the living room after dinner. Sometimes she'd ask for help with something small, a printer, a form, a decision, and he would drop everything, just to be useful again. Each of those moments felt like redemption in fragments. Not a grand forgiveness, not a cinematic reunion, just the slow rebuilding of presence, one quiet act at a time. He realized that regret doesn't disappear when you understand it. It just becomes something you live with, something that shapes you into a gentler version of who you were. He stopped trying to erase the years he lost. Instead, he started learning how to inhabit the ones still left. One evening, he sat outside, watching the sunset spill across the yard. His son joined him without being asked. They didn't talk much, they didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer distance, it was peace. He looked at his son and thought, maybe this is what wealth was meant to be. Not something you earn, but something you feel when you finally stop running. And for the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about tomorrow's deadlines, or bills, or promotions. He was simply present, in a life he had nearly forgotten to live. The house feels different now. Not louder, just alive again. There's a rhythm to the silence, a quiet balance between what's been lost and what remains. The walls no longer echo with emptiness. They hum with traces of laughter, footsteps, conversation. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of sounds he used to overlook while chasing something he could never hold. He still works. But now, his briefcase stays closed on weekends. The desk in his home office gathers a thin layer of dust, and for once, he lets it. On Sunday mornings, he makes breakfast instead of checking emails. His wife reads the paper beside him. His son eats slowly, telling stories that wander nowhere but make them all smile. It isn't perfect. There are still reminders, the photos from years he missed, the memories that belong to a version of him who was absent. But those ghosts have softened. They no longer haunt him. They just remind him. Sometimes he walks past his old office building on his way home. The lights are still on late, the same cars still parked out front, the same faces glowing under fluorescent fatigue. He used to be one of them, chasing a finish line that only ever moved further away. Now, he just watches for a moment, then keeps walking. He doesn't feel envy. Just clarity. At night, when the house grows still, he sits by the window, the same window where, years ago, his children once waited for him. The streetlight outside flickers softly. He can see his reflection in the glass, older, quieter, but finally whole. He understands now that love isn't something you earn by sacrifice. It's something you give by presence. All his life, he believed he was working for his family. But in truth, the only thing they ever wanted was him. Now, he spends his days not building wealth, but time. Time for conversation. Time for laughter. Time for peace. because he finally learned the one truth his years of success never taught him. You can always make more money, but you can never buy back a single moment you missed. And so, the man who once lived for tomorrow now lives, quietly, in today.